All right, so here we're going to start the notes for 1.5, and we're just going to quickly review adding integers. And of course, integers is that set of number that contains positives and negatives. So if we just quickly look at a number line, I like to look at the number line so you can see a visual of what's happening as we add these integers. I'm going to just put the even numbers on my number line. All right, so here. So 2 plus 1. How do I do that on a number line? Well, I start at 2. And since I'm adding 1, I go to the right 1. And where do I end up? I end up at 3. 0 plus 5. Start at 0. Since I'm adding 5, I go to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where do I end up? I end up at 5. Let's go negative. Negative 2 plus negative 3. So I'm going to start at negative 2. Now I'm adding negative 3. So if I'm adding negative 3, I can't go to the right positively, even though I'm adding a negative 3. So I go to the left, 1, 2, 3. And you can see I end up at negative 5. And negative 1 plus negative 6 means I would have to go to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can see I end up at negative 7. So here's the rule for adding numbers if they have the same sign. So in other words, 2 positives or 2 negatives. So whatever that sign is, you use that in the answer. So 2 negatives are going to make a negative answer. 2 positives are going to make the positive answer. And then you add the absolute values of the numbers. So if the numbers are positive, then your sum is positive. If the numbers are negative, then your sum is negative. So if we look at 1a, my answer is going to be positive. Why? Because these 2 numbers are positive, and when I add their absolute values, 26 and 6 is 32. Here, I'm going to have my answer is going to be negative because both of the values are negative, and I simply add the absolute values. 5 and 36 gives me 41. Over here, we're adding negative 14 and negative 6, so my answer is going to be negative. And if I add the absolute values, 14 and 6, I'm going to get 20. Notice these parentheses, by the way, they're not being used as a grouping symbol. All they're doing is separating the positive and the negative. That's all they're doing. Same thing over here. I put both of them. Just you're going to see it all different ways, so I thought I would put all different things in your notes. Okay, so now what happens if I'm adding 2 numbers with different signs? So I'm again, you can pause me whenever you want. I'm going to just draw a number line, just so you can see a visual. So 3 plus negative 2. We start at 3. And since I'm adding a negative 2, I'm going to go down to the left, 1, 2, and where do I end up? I end up at 1. Negative 6 plus, and this is a positive 2, so I start at negative 6. But I'm going to go, because it's a positive 2 to the right, and you can see I end up at negative 4. Negative 4 plus positive 10, I'll start off at negative 4. Since I'm adding a positive, I'm going to go to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 spaces. You can see I end up at positive 6. 8 plus negative 12. If I start off at 8, this time I'm adding, but I'm adding a negative. So I'm going to go to the left, 12 spaces. Well, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 spaces. I'm going to end up at the number, whoopsie, let's try that again. 8 plus negative 12. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. I end up at negative 4. Hello. Okay, so now What does that mean for the rule? Notice out of a 4 and a 10, I get 6. I can't get that from adding the absolute value, so the rule must tell me to do something else, and here it is. Here's the rule for adding two numbers with different signs. In other words, a positive and a negative. First of all, the sign of your answer will be the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. And then you find the difference between the larger absolute value and the smaller absolute value. In other words, you keep the sign of the larger absolute value and subtract. So, here we go. Negative 15 plus 5. So we're adding a negative and a positive, two numbers with different signs. So your sign of your answer will be the sign of the larger absolute value, which is going to be the 15, so it's going to be a negative. And then you simply subtract the absolute values. 15 minus 5 is 10. 8 plus negative 22. So again, the negative 22 has the larger absolute value, so my answer is going to be negative. And 22 minus 8 is 14. Negative 32 plus 40, the sign of my answer will be positive because the 40 has the larger absolute value. And 40 minus 32 is 8. So this should all just be a quick review for you. We're going to do a lot of properties in the last section. Here's our first one, kind of an introduction to a property. It's the additive inverse property, which says if I have a number x, and if I add to it negative x, I'm always going to get 0. So if I plug in a number for x, 5 plus negative 5 is equal to 0. That's what that property says. And of course, this is just the same thing, but the numbers are switched. So in other words, negative 5 plus 5 is equal to 0. Do you remember what word we had for 5 and negative 5, or 2 and negative 2, or 10 and negative 10 before? They were called opposites. Okay? When you add two opposites, you're always going to get 0. That's what this property says. So if we look at example 3, it says, what is A? Find the value of A given that this statement is true. So in other words, what can I add to negative 24 that's going to get me a 0? Well, obviously, A has to be the opposite of negative 24, which is positive 24. So I've just used my additive inverse property. So we're going to do some more adding down here, but here we have more numbers to add. So it's addition. We're going to go in order from left to right. So 10 plus negative 7. Well, we subtract the absolute values and take the sign of the larger absolute value. So that's going to be a positive 3. So when I added these, I got 3. 3 plus 3, that's easy. That's 6. Now I'm adding two numbers with different signs. My answer is going to be negative because the 12 has the larger absolute value. And I subtract or find the difference between the absolute values, and 12 minus 6 is 6. Let's go over here to B. Negative 32 plus 5. Well, if I add those, first of all, I'm going to get a negative because the 32 has the larger absolute value. And if I find the difference, I'm going to get 27. Here I'm adding two numbers with the same sign. So I add the absolute values, and my answer is going to be negative. So that's going to be negative 35. And look what I have. The opposite, so I know their sum is going to be 0. And finally, we're going to do some plug and chug, evaluate. So look at number 5a. It says evaluate this expression, so m plus negative 5 plus n, and I'm giving you that m is negative 4 and n is 8. So let's plug in those values. So negative 4 plus negative 5 plus 8. So I just plugged in -4 for m and 8 for n. Now let's go ahead and add them in order from left to right. So -4 plus -5. I'm adding two numbers with the same sign, so I take the sign and add the absolute values. -9 plus 8, I'm going to go ahead, and since the signs are different, I take the sign of the larger absolute value, so that's going to be negative, and I find the difference between their absolute values, and the difference between 9 and 8 is 1. If you haven't started doing this already, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and do B on your own, and then come back and watch me do it, and hopefully we get the same answer. So when we plug in the -1 for x, we have to be careful, because remember this negative sign was already there, but it's not part of the x. Plus -7 is y, plus -6. So there's my plug. Now here, remember this says the opposite of -1, so that's actually 1. So let's take care of that first. So if I start at the left, I'm adding 1 plus -7. My answer is going to be negative because 7 has the larger absolute value. And 7 minus 1 is 6. Now be careful here. Don't get ahead of yourself. Here I'm adding two numbers with the same sign, which means my answer is negative, and I add the absolute values to get 12. Be careful you don't go too quickly and think that these are opposites of one another. -6 is not the opposite of -6. And there's the end of 1.5.